The lake holds still on the morning of the 10th of June, 1854, glass flat under a sky doing its best impression of high summer, and for one suspended moment before the gates properly open, the whole scene looks like something painted rather than live. Sydenham Hill rises green behind acres of new gravel walk. The Crystal Palace itself throws sheets of white light across the grass behind the crowd. Its iron ribs and its 100,000 panes of glass, rebuilt here, 3 miles south of Hyde Park, larger than it had ever been before. Across the artificial lake, half hidden among reeds still finding their footing after a winter's planting, 30 feet of grey-brown reptile crouches on legs like tree trunks, its back a ridge of armor plate, its small blunt head turned toward the crowd as if it too is waiting for the day to begin. A young woman stands near the iron rail at the water's edge, one hand pressed flat against her bonnet, against a breeze that has not yet arrived, the other gripping the fist of a small boy who has already worked one shoe half off his foot. Her dress is her good dress, a soft grey wool with a fitted bodice and a skirt wide enough that she has had to turn sideways twice already to let other families pass along the path. Her collar is buttoned to the throat. Her waist has been laced into a shape her body does not naturally make. She has walked the better part of 2 miles from the new railway station in shoes meant for standing rather than walking, and she has done it smiling, because a day like this one, a whole afternoon set aside for wonder rather than work, comes perhaps 3 or 4 times a year for a family like hers, and she intends to enjoy every hour of it. Beside her, a young man in a dark wool coat too heavy for the season watches the reptile across the water with an attention that has nothing to do with tourism. He knows the exact weight of that tail. He spent the better part of a winter with the grit of its cement settled into the creases of his palms. But to the family beside him, and to the thousands now filing down the new paths from the station, he is simply another spectator, another father come to see the marvel the London papers have been promising since Christmas. Life-sized monsters from before the beginning of recorded time, built solid enough to host a dinner party inside one animal's belly, arranged around an ornamental leg like specimens laid out under glass, waiting to be looked at by anyone with a shilling and a Sunday coat. It is, by any honest measure, one of the strangest and most magnificent things Victorian England has ever built purely for its own delight. 40,000 people will pass through these gates before the day is finished. Before the year is out, the total will run into the millions. Beneath the wonder of it, underneath the wool and the whalebone and the varnish, still faintly tacky where the June sun has caught it, an entirely different day is happening, one with its own weather, its own hazards, its own smells, and its own reckoning with a body that did not sign on to spend an afternoon standing in the sun pretending it was not thirsty, was not exhausted, and was not, in the specific and increasingly documented sense the medical men of this era were only beginning to argue about, afraid. This is Sydenham, south of London, on the 10th of June 1854, and the England gathered around this lake believes several things about itself that will not survive the century fully intact. It believes it has mastered engineering, having already dismantled an entire iron and glass palace in Hyde Park and rebuilt it, larger, on a hillside 3 miles away, an achievement no other nation on earth has attempted, let alone finished. It believes it has mastered the deep past as well, having reconstructed more than 30 extinct creatures, with enough confidence to charge admission for the privilege of viewing them and enough certainty to publish the results as settled science rather than educated guesswork. And it believes, perhaps most of all, in the outing itself, in the idea that a family of very modest means can put on its good clothes, board a train, and spend a summer afternoon safely marveling at monsters before going home unharmed. Two of those three beliefs will hold up reasonably well against the following century of scrutiny. The third is considerably more complicated than anyone standing at the rail this morning has any particular reason to suspect. Britain in 1854 is only 3 years removed from the Great Exhibition, the event that convinced an entire nation of its own machine-made destiny, and the animals ringing this lake are in part a sequel to that triumph, proof that the same confidence which had already produced railways, rifles, and steamships could also reach backward, cross geological time, and drag its monsters into the light for public inspection. Geology itself is something close to a live wire this summer. The rocks are telling a story that runs to millions of years, a story that does not fit tidily inside the biblical chronology most of the people at this rail were raised on, and the anatomist who has guided every reconstruction on this site, Sir Richard Owen, coiner of the word dinosaur a dozen years earlier, has built much of his career on the argument that ancient life was ordered, hierarchical, and designed rather than the product of slow, undirected accident. The animals of Sydenham are not neutral entertainment. They are an argument built out of brick, cement, iron hoop, and paint about who is properly in charge of the story of the earth, delivered to a paying public that has come whether it knows it or not. This video is about what that reassurance actually cost, physically, to the ordinary bodies that came to receive it. Not the dinosaurs themselves, wonderful as they undeniably are, but everything the day of seeing them demanded of an ordinary Victorian body. It meant the miles walked without a drop of clean water, the wool and whalebone worn straight through a genuine June heatwave, the paint drying on prehistoric skin with ingredients nobody in the crowd thought to question, the water in the ornamental lake that visitors feared nearly as much as they admired the animals standing in it, and the crush of 30 or 40,000 people funneled along paths never built to hold a fraction of that number. It is the story of what a great Victorian spectacle demanded of the people who came to look at it, told partly through the eyes of a man who spent the previous winter with his hands inside the monsters rather than admiring them from a comfortable distance. Before we go further, if the unfiltered version of history, the one that keeps the wonder fully intact while also telling you exactly what the postcard left out, happens to be the kind you value, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps keep this channel doing the research that a story like this one actually requires. And if there is an error you would like to see taken apart this same way, leave it in the comments below. I read every one of them. Let us begin, as this particular story has to begin, with the man who was standing inside these creatures long before anyone else was permitted to look at them from the outside. His name, for the purposes of this evening, is Josiah Webb, and no single Josiah Webb appears in the surviving parish registers or wage books of Sydenham in 1853. But a great deal of documented record exists about men exactly like him, the workforce of bricklayers, plasterers, and general labourers hired through that autumn and winter by the sculptor Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins to build, brick by brick and bucket by bucket. Josiah is 23 years old, born in Bermondsey to a family of tanners, and he has spent most of his working life doing the kind of labour that leaves permanent marks on a person, cracked knuckles, a lower back that aches by early afternoon regardless of the weather, forearms roped with the particular muscle that comes from hauling wet mortar rather than lifting weight for sport. He is not a sculptor. He did not shape a single scale, claw, or eyelid. He mixed cement in the enormous quantities the work required, hauled brick up scaffolding, erected inside the hollow legs of animals, larger than any building he had personally helped raise before, and stood for hours at a stretch inside a ribcage of iron hoop and timber, while Hawkins and his modelers argued and occasionally simply guessed at what the outside of an iguanodon ought to look like. He was taken on in October of 1853, when the site still resembled a shipyard more than a museum, and released from the payroll in April of 1854. 2 months before the gates opened to the public, he now stands among. 9 months of his labor sit buried inside those animals, sealed under a skin of painted cement that not one visitor filing past the lake this morning will ever think to associate with a specific man's hands. This is not a grievance Josiah would think to voice out loud. It is simply the arrangement, the same arrangement that puts a bricklayer's hands inside a cathedral wall and a seamstress's eyesight inside a wedding gown. Invisible labor absorbed entirely into a finished object that receives its own name. He stands a little over 5.5 feet tall, wiry rather than broad, with the permanent squint of a man who has spent years working outdoors in weather that never once adjusted itself to a laborer's convenience. His wife, Harriet, is 21, and beside her walks their son Alfred, not yet 2 years old, currently attempting to remove his own shoe for the 3rd time this hour. Harriet has dressed with real care for today. The grey wool dress is the good one, laundered and pressed the night before, its bodice boned tightly enough that by the 2nd mile from the station, she has begun taking noticeably shallower breaths without entirely registering that she is doing it. She is proud of how she looks, and she has every reason to be. She is also, quietly, already uncomfortable in ways she has no polite vocabulary for describing, and no particular expectation that anyone would want to hear about, even if she did. Josiah's one private vanity, the single small indulgence he allows himself on a day like today, is his hat, a black felt topper bought second-hand from a stall near London Bridge 2 years earlier, and kept in careful condition ever since, brushed and reblocked, the one article of clothing he owns that makes him look for a few hours at a stretch like a man who was never on his knees in wet cement at all. He wears it now tipped slightly forward against the sun, and if you asked him what occupied his thoughts as he walked his small family down the gravel path toward the lake, he would probably tell you he was thinking about the iguanodon specifically, wondering whether the paint on its flank had finally cured through the winter damp, whether the hairline cracks he had noticed back in March had been properly patched, whether the thing he had spent 9 months of his own body constructing would hold up, quite literally, under the weight of 40,000 strangers' attention. It will. Mostly. The animals are structurally sound, and several will in fact still be standing in London more than a century and a half later, weathering wars and decades of institutional neglect, rather better than most Victorian buildings, judged more important at the time. What will not hold up nearly so well on this particular June afternoon is everybody's body, including the bodies of the 2 people who helped build the thing and the one small person who will spend most of the day being carried between them. Today is meant to be simple. The train from Bermondsey to the new station, built specifically to receive Crystal Palace's crowds, a walk through the grounds, a good long look at the animals Josiah helped raise from the ground up, supper before dark. It will not be simple. Almost nothing about this day, for anyone attending it, will turn out to be quite as simple as the handbills advertising the opening have promised. That story begins, as it has to, at ground level. In a crowd of tens of thousands of Victorians, all trying to reach the same gate at the same hour, dressed for church rather than for a route march across gravel dust and standing summer heat. If you picture the crowd travelling to Sydenham the 10th of June, you probably picture something orderly, a Victorian queue in the popular imagination being a fairly polite institution, rows of families filing calmly toward a turnstile the way a church congregation files toward communion. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and it is wrong in a way that matters, because the journey itself was where the day's first real toll on the body was taken. hours before anyone had so much as glimpsed a single reptile across the water. The actual reality was a transport system built for a fraction of the demand now being placed on it, straining at every seam. A new railway line, the West End of London and Crystal Palace Railway, had been rushed to completion specifically to serve this opening. Its station finished with days rather than weeks to spare, and even that fresh capacity proved nowhere near sufficient. Existing lines running south from London Bridge toward Croydon were pressed into service alongside it, their ordinary schedules abandoned in favour of special excursion trains packed to a density no railway company of the period had actually planned for. Carriages built to hold a modest number of seated passengers in reasonable comfort were instead crammed well past capacity, with standing passengers wedged into corridors and doorways, children lifted bodily over the heads of strangers simply to find a few inches of space to stand in. Contemporary accounts of the opening describe roads approaching Sydenham from every direction choked with foot traffic, omnibuses, private carriages, and hired cabs moving at something closer to a crawl than a drive, the whole mass of vehicles and pedestrians converging on a single hillside from a dozen different routes at once. For a family without the fare, a cab, which described the overwhelming majority of the working people making this journey. The final approach to the grounds meant walking, often for a mile or more, along dusty verges never designed to carry pedestrian traffic at all, sharing the road's edge with carriage wheels and horse traffic moving directly beside them. None of this had much to do with weather forecasting or crowd control in the modern sense, because neither concept existed yet in any form the organizers of the day would have recognized. The Crystal Palace Company had sold as many tickets as the market would bear, understanding correctly that public appetite for the new palace and its prehistoric monsters was close to insatiable without any particularly developed sense of what 40,000 simultaneous arrivals would actually do to a single hillside's worth of roads, paths, and railway platforms. The planning that had gone into the statues themselves, the careful geological ordering of the islands, the painstaking correspondence between Owen and Hawkins over the proper curve of a rib or the placement of a horn, had no real counterpart in the planning that went into simply moving that many human bodies from London to Sydenham and back again in a single day. Part of what made this particular day so uniquely overwhelming was the occasion itself. The 10th of June, 1854, was not simply another day the grounds happened to be open. It was the official reopening ceremony presided over by Queen Victoria in person, marking the completed reconstruction of the entire Crystal Palace on its new Sydenham site after 2 years of rebuilding, and the event had been planned as a spectacle to match. A choir and orchestra, numbering more than 1,700 performers, drawn from Covent Garden's own musicians and choirs, recruited from towns across the country, filled the central transept with music for an audience of some 30,000 seated and standing listeners. While the total number of visitors admitted to the grounds that day is generally put at around 40,000, a figure large enough that the Crystal Palace Company's own arrangements for moving, feeding, and accommodating that many people simultaneously were tested well past anything the company had previously attempted. Josiah's family had not come for the music or the royal procession, and would see neither at any close distance, but the crush they experienced on the roads and railway platforms that morning was, in this sense, not an unlucky coincidence. It was the direct and entirely predictable result of the single largest single-day crowd the new grounds had yet been asked to hold. For Josiah, Harriet, and Alfred, the journey began well before dawn, a necessity rather than a preference, since the family had heard enough rumor of the crowds expected that they judged an early start their only real chance of a train with room to breathe in. Even so, The platform at their local station was already thick with people by the time they arrived, most of them dressed, like Josiah and Harriet, in whatever passed in their household for their finest clothing. Because an outing to see the new Crystal Palace was understood by everyone attending it as a formal occasion, regardless of a family's income. The kind of day that called for a hat rather than a cap, a proper dress rather than a work frock. Harriet held Alfred against her hip for the better part of an hour on the platform before a train, with space enough to board, arrived at all. And when it did arrive, the carriage they managed to squeeze into held perhaps twice the number of passengers. Bodies pressed close enough that Josiah found himself holding his own elbows tucked against his ribs, simply to avoid jostling the stranger beside him. Alfred, initially delighted by the noise and novelty of the train, grew restless somewhere past Croydon, overheated by the press of unmoving adult bodies around him, and by a wool jacket Harriet had dressed him in that morning without fully anticipating how warm the carriage would become. By the time the family disembarked at the new Crystal Palace station and joined the river of pedestrians moving up the hill toward the grounds, all three of them were already tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the day's actual attraction, and everything to do with simply having arrived at it. The walk from the station to the grounds themselves, a distance the handbills described in the breezy language of a pleasant stroll, in practice meant a slow, shuffling procession along paths shared with thousands of other families moving at exactly the same pace, unable to walk faster even had they wished to, hemmed in on every side by prams, walking sticks, trailing children, and the occasional cart delivering supplies to the grounds ahead of the crowd. Dust rose from the dry June road under the weight of so many feet and wheels, settling on dark wool coats and pale summer dresses alike, so that by the time a family reached the actual gates of the park, their good clothes already carried a fine film of London area road dust that no amount of careful dressing that morning could have anticipated or prevented. This was, in its way, one of the quieter costs of Victorian mass spectacle, a cost that fell almost entirely on people who could not afford to arrive by private carriage, and therefore experienced the crowd not as an inconvenient backdrop to the day. The historian Judith Flanders, writing about the texture of everyday travel in this period, has noted how routinely Victorian excursions of every kind, from railway holidays to church outings, involved exactly this sort of improvised endurance and physical discomfort as the ordinary and expected price of admission to a single afternoon of leisure, because leisure itself was rationed carefully enough in this era that almost nobody was inclined to let mere physical unpleasantness stand between themselves. The same appetite that drew 40,000 people to Sydenham on a single June morning was the appetite of a population starved for exactly this kind of shared public wonder, and starvation, as a rule, does not wait for ideal traveling conditions. There is something clarifying about recognizing this pattern before the day has properly begun, about understanding that the crush on the train and the dust on the road were not incidental to the Crystal Palace opening, but were, in a real sense, built into its very design. An inevitable consequence of selling tickets to everyone who wanted one, without any corresponding plan for managing the bodies those tickets represented. Josiah, Harriet, and Alfred had not yet seen a single dinosaur. They had already spent the better part of a morning being crushed, jostled, dusted, and overheated in the simple act of trying to reach one, and the sun, as they finally passed through the gates and onto the gravel paths proper, had not yet climbed anywhere near its highest point of the day. Which brings us to the question of what these bodies were actually wearing, because the crush of the journey was only the first layer of a physical problem that would follow every visitor through the entire length of the day. If you imagine Victorian summer dress, you probably picture something reasonably breathable, pale cottons and light straw hats, an outfit sensibly adjusted for warm weather the way a modern summer wardrobe would be. For the wealthiest visitors to Sydenham that June, dressed in the lightest fabrics fashion allowed, there was some truth in that picture. For almost everyone else on the grounds that day, the actual reality bore very little resemblance to it. Harriet's grey wool dress was not an unusual choice for a working family's best outfit. Wool was durable, held its shape and its dye far better than lighter fabrics over repeated wear, and represented, for a household with one good dress to its name, a sensible long-term investment regardless of season. The dress was worn, as fashion required, over a corset boned with either whalebone or steel, laced firmly enough to produce the fashionable narrowed waist and the correspondingly rigid upright posture Victorian femininity prized above almost any other physical quality a woman could display in public. Under the corset came a chemise, and under the skirt itself layers of petticoat, sometimes stiffened with horsehair or by the 1,850 seconds, increasingly supported by a crinoline frame designed to hold the skirt's fashionable bell shape without requiring quite so many separate layers of fabric to achieve it. Stockings, generally wool or a wool blend even in summer, completed an outfit that had been assembled, garment by garment, with almost no reference to the actual temperature a body might encounter while wearing it outdoors for the better part of a day. Josiah's own clothing carried a similar burden in a different register. His coat, dark wool, cut in a sober, practical style suitable for a respectable outing, sat over a waistcoat and a shirt with a stiff, high collar, the entire ensemble finished with his good hat, the black felt topper he had cared for so carefully over the preceding 2 years. None of it had been designed with a June heatwave in mind, because respectable Victorian dress for both men and women was governed far less by seasonal comfort than by an elaborate, largely unspoken code of social presentation, one in which the visible layers, the correct silhouette, and the appropriate degree of coverage mattered considerably more than whether the wearer was, at any given moment, uncomfortably warm. By late morning, with the sun now well up, and the day settling into genuine early summer heat, the physical cost of all this fabric had become impossible for Harriet to ignore. The wool held heat against her skin the way a blanket does, trapping warmth rather than releasing it, and the corset underneath compounded the problem considerably, restricting the natural expansion of her ribcage with every breath, and making the kind of deep, cooling exhale a body instinctively wants to take in heat almost physically impossible to achieve. Sweat gathered under the boning where the fabric pressed tightest against her skin, with no easy means of evaporating through layers of wool, cotton and horsehair padding, and a faint light-headedness, the specific swimming sensation many corseted Victorian women described in their own letters and diaries as, the day wore on, had begun to settle in behind her eyes. Well before noon, she said nothing about it. There was, in the vocabulary available to a respectable woman of her class and period, no entirely comfortable way to announce in mixed company that one's undergarments were making it difficult to breathe, and so she did what an enormous number of women around her were doing at exactly the same moment, which was simply to endure it quietly, while continuing to smile for her son's benefit and her husband's. The living historian, Ruth Goodman, who has spent years actually wearing reconstructed period clothing through ordinary daily tasks in all seasons, in order to understand it from the inside, rather than merely describing it from a museum case, has written extensively about how genuinely punishing Victorian dress became in hot weather, particularly for women whose corsetry restricted the deep breathing the body relies on to help regulate its own temperature. Goodman's own experiments wearing full Victorian dress through a summer day describe symptoms strikingly similar to what a woman like Harriet would have experienced: a persistent low-grade dizziness, an inability to cool down even while standing still in shade, and a fatigue that accumulated steadily over hours rather than announcing itself all at once. Layered wool, whalebone, and horsehair were not incidental discomforts bolted onto an otherwise sensible outfit. They were, functionally a heat trap worn directly against the skin for the entire length of a summer day. And the fact that Victorian society had collectively agreed to treat this as simply what respectable dress required did nothing to change what it actually did to the bodies wearing it. The men fared somewhat better, if only by degree. Josiah's wool coat and stiff collar held heat in much the same way. Harriet's dress did, though without the added restriction of boning around his ribs, and a working man's frame, more accustomed to physical exertion in all weather, tolerated the heat with somewhat more resilience than a woman whose daily life allowed for considerably less open-air labor. Alfred, dressed by his mother that morning in a small wool jacket appropriate to a formal family outing, had no such resilience at all, and by midday had grown flushed and fretful in his mother's arms, his small face pink with the heat his toddler's body had no real mechanism for managing gracefully. Harriet found herself, more than once over the following hours, loosening his collar slightly when she judged no one of consequence was watching, a small private act of quiet rebellion against a dress code that had never been designed with a 2-year-old's comfort anywhere in its calculations. The broader context here says something fairly pointed about how differently Victorian society understood the relationship between clothing and the body than we generally do now. Comfort, in the modern sense of the word, was simply not a primary design consideration for respectable dress in 1854, particularly for women, whose clothing was understood first and foremost as a visible expression of moral character, social position, and feminine restraint, with physical ease treated as, at best, a secondary and somewhat suspect concern. A woman who complained openly about the heat of her own corset risked being read as someone unable to bear the ordinary demands of respectable femininity, a judgment serious enough that most women simply absorbed the discomfort in silence rather than risk it. Wealthier visitors to Sydenham that day had some advantage in lighter, better tailored fabrics and the option of resting in shaded refreshment areas between exertions, but even fashionable summer muslin worn over the same foundational undergarments offered only a partial reprieve from a system of dress built around presentation. The heat was, in this sense, democratic in its cause, and considerably less democratic in its effect, falling hardest on the people least able to escape either the sun itself or a full day of standing. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that an entire crowd of 40,000 people spent a summer day slowly overheating inside clothing, chosen almost entirely for how it looked rather than how it felt, and did so without any particular sense that this represented a design failure rather than simply the ordinary cost of appearing correctly dressed in public. Harriet would not have described her own morning in those terms. She would likely have described herself, if asked, as having had a lovely time so far, a little warm perhaps, nothing worth remarking on. And in a sense, she would have been telling the truth, because a lovely time and a slowly overheating body were not, in her experience, or in the experience of nearly everyone standing near her, understood as contradictory conditions. They were simply what a day out looked like for a woman dressed the way the era required her to dress. 6 months earlier, on the last night of 1853, Josiah had stood outside the very animal his family was now walking toward, close enough to hear the laughter coming from inside it, and the story of that night says a great deal about who this spectacle was actually built to serve and who was expected merely to build it. If you imagine a formal Victorian dinner party, you probably picture a well-appointed dining room, a long table set with silver and crystal, perhaps 20 guests in evening dress, exchanging polite conversation over several courses. Move that entire scene inside the hollow, unfinished body of a life-sized iguanodon, still under construction, its cement skin not yet fully cured, and you have a reasonably accurate picture of what actually happened on the grounds at Sydenham on the 31st of December, 1853. Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, the sculptor overseeing the entire project, had conceived of the dinner as something close to a publicity event, a way of demonstrating both the sheer physical scale of his reconstructions and his own confidence in the science behind them. And the plan he settled on was audacious even by the standards of an era that specialized in audacious public demonstrations. 21 guests, all men, all drawn from the worlds of science publishing and Crystal Palace finance, were invited to dine on New Year's Eve inside the mold used to cast the iguanodon's body, seated at a long table arranged down the length of the animal's torso under a canopy improvised from tarpaulin and lamplight. Invitations, printed on paper cut in the shape of a pterodactyl's wing, promised guests an evening unlike any dinner party previously offered in England, and the promise turned out to be entirely accurate. Sir Richard Owen himself, the anatomist whose scientific authority underpinned the entire reconstruction project, was seated at the head of the table, positioned inside the skull of the animal, a placement everyone present understood as both a joke and a genuine tribute to the man regarded, correctly, as the intellectual architect behind the whole undertaking. Other guests included the paleontologist Edward Forbes, later remembered as one of the era's more irreverent scientific wits, the geologist Joseph Prestwich, and the ornithologist John Gould, along with Francis Fuller, the managing director of the Crystal Palace Company itself, whose financial stake in the evening's success was considerably more direct than anyone else's at the table. The dinner ran to 8 courses accompanied by a substantial quantity of wine, and by most surviving accounts the evening grew progressively louder and more celebratory as it went on, culminating in toasts, comic verses composed for the occasion, and a good deal of the specific kind of self-congratulation that flows naturally among men who understand themselves to be present at a genuinely historic moment. When offered a short speech praising the scientific accuracy of Hawkins' work, a claim that later paleontology would substantially revise, though nobody at the table that night had any reason to doubt it. Newspaper coverage of the dinner spread the story of scientists dining inside a dinosaur across England within days, giving the Crystal Palace Company exactly the kind of publicity Hawkins had hoped to generate, and the event has remained, in the century and a half since, one of the more thoroughly charming anecdotes, a story that still gets repeated today, usually with real affection, as an example of Victorian scientific enthusiasm at its most delightfully theatrical. What that popular retelling almost always leaves out is who was standing outside in the cold while it happened. Josiah was one of the small number of laborers kept on site that particular night, not as guests, but as the men responsible for the practical logistics the dinner actually required. That meant hauling in the long trestle table and its borrowed chairs, rigging temporary lamps along the length of the mold's interior, keeping a fire going nearby for the kitchen staff preparing the 8 courses, and standing ready outside in case anything involving the temporary structure required urgent attention over the course of the evening. He had spent the better part of that autumn with his hands and forearms inside this exact animal, and on New Year's Eve he stood a few feet from its exterior wall in the dark, wrapped against a cold December night, considerably less forgiving than the June heat his family would later endure. Listening to 21 of England's most eminent scientific gentlemen laugh and toast one another inside a structure he had personally helped raise out of brick and wet cement. There is no recrimination in this observation, and it would likely have puzzled Josiah to hear the arrangement described as unjust, since it reflected, in his experience, simply the ordinary shape of the world as he understood it. Men of Owen's standing dined. Men of Josiah's standing built the room they dined in, and then waited outside it, a distinction so thoroughly embedded in the social architecture of 1853 England that it required no particular explanation and received almost none. What the arrangement does illustrate, with unusual clarity, is exactly how the era's grand demonstrations of scientific and industrial achievement were actually produced. An enormous amount of unglamorous, physically demanding, frequently uncomfortable labor performed by men whose names went unrecorded in service of a spectacle that would be remembered, celebrated, and eventually mythologized around the small number of names that happened to be seated at the table when it counted. The broader context matters here, because the Iguanodon dinner was not an isolated curiosity so much as a particularly vivid example of how Victorian scientific culture generally operated. Original research in this period remained heavily concentrated among gentlemen of independent means or salaried positions at institutions like the British Museum, men who could afford the years of unpaid study that a scientific reputation required, while the physical infrastructure supporting that research, the construction of specimens and displays, the daily maintenance of collections, depended overwhelmingly on paid laborers whose own observations and expertise rarely made it into the published record under their own names. Historians of Victorian science, including Adrian Desmond, who has written extensively about the social and political dimensions of the period's paleontological disputes, have noted how thoroughly this class divide shaped which names survived in the historical record and which did not, a pattern the Iguanodon dinner reproduces almost perfectly. 1. Carefully documented evening of celebration built directly on top of months of undocumented labor. Josiah, for his part, went home that particular night to a cold room in lodgings near the site, ate whatever supper his landlady had kept warm for him, and reported back to the workshop the following morning to continue the same work he had been doing for months. The small ceremony of the previous evening having changed nothing at all about his own working conditions or his own wages. It is worth noting, standing here 6 months later at the edge of the same lake, that the animal those 21 gentlemen dined inside is the very one his family is now approaching, its skin fully cured, its cracks patched, its interior emptied of tables and lamps, and 8 courses of Victorian celebration. Purely structural purpose it had actually been built to serve. Josiah knows this. His family does not, and there is no obvious moment in the day ahead when he will think to mention it. Some kinds of knowledge simply travel that way, carried privately by the people who have it, largely unremarked upon by everyone standing around them. Now the animals themselves, because the science standing behind them was where the Victorian confidence on display at Sydenham became hardest to separate from Victorian wishful thinking. If you picture a dinosaur today, you are almost certainly picturing something closer to a large, active bird than a reptile, a creature that walked on 2 legs at least some of the time, held its tail off the ground for balance, and moved with the kind of quick, muscular efficiency modern paleontology has spent the last several decades painstakingly reconstructing from bone structure, muscle attachment points, and comparisons with living dinosaurs, which is to say, birds. The animals standing around this lake in 1854 look almost nothing like that picture, and the difference is not a matter of artistic exaggeration. It reflects the actual carefully reasoned scientific consensus of the period built by the best-trained anatomist in England, using the best evidence then available and arriving, through no particular fault of anyone involved, at conclusions that later evidence, the actual reality of Richard Owen's science and Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins' sculpture built directly on top of it, treated the iguanodon as something close to a gigantic, thick-skinned quadruped in the general mold of a rhinoceros or an elephant, walking heavily on all 4 legs. The horn Hawkins placed on the animal's snout, a detail that made it into nearly every printed illustration of the Crystal Palace iguanodon, was in fact based on a real fossil bone Owen had available for study, a large, curved, pointed structure that seemed reasonably enough, given the anatomical evidence at hand, to belong somewhere on the animal's head. Later, paleontology would identify that same bone as a spur located on the iguanodon's thumb, part of a hand structure entirely unlike anything Owen had reason to suspect from the fragmentary remains available to him in the 1,840 seconds. The Megalosaurus similarly appears at Sydenham as a heavy bear-like quadruped, rather than the more agile bipedal predator later. Far more complete fossil discoveries would eventually reveal it to have been. None of this reflects carelessness on Owen's part. It reflects the genuine limits of the fossil record available to him: a scattered handful of teeth, jaw fragments, and isolated bones from which an entire animal's posture, gait, and proportions had to be inferred using the only comparative method then available, which was measuring those fragments against the skeletons of large living reptiles and mammals and reasoning outward from there. What made Owen's particular reconstructions distinctive, and what turned them into something closer to argument than pure description, was the theoretical framework he brought to that inference. Owen was, by 1854, one of the most prominent and most determined opponents in England of what would later be called evolutionary transformism, the idea, already circulating in works like the anonymously published Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation a decade earlier, that species might change gradually over time through some natural, POM-directed process rather than remaining fixed as originally created. Owen's professional, most accounts, genuinely held personal position was that the fossil record instead revealed a series of distinct, purposefully designed forms, each suited perfectly to its own era, arranged in a pattern of increasing complexity. Reconstructing the Iguanodon and Megalosaurus as massive, heavily built, almost mammal-like quadrupeds, animals that looked less like ancestral reptiles and more like an early, deliberate rehearsal for the large mammals that would come later, fit comfortably inside that larger argument. Whether or not Owen consciously shaped his interpretation of the bones to support it. The historian Adrian Desmond has written at length about how thoroughly Owen's paleontology was entangled with the political and religious anxieties of his moment, arguing that Owen's insistence on designed, just continuous creation carried real institutional stakes for a Church of England establishment deeply invested in a natural world that confirmed rather than challenged scriptural authority. There is an imperial dimension to this as well, one that rarely makes it into the popular retelling of the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs as a simple story of charming scientific error. A nation that had spent the preceding decades building the largest empire in human history and had just spent 3 years celebrating its own industrial supremacy at the Great Exhibition, found something deeply satisfying in the idea that its scientists could reach back across tens of millions of years, orderly mastery over prehistoric time that its engineers and administrators were imposing across the map. The Crystal Palace Dinosaurs were funded, in part, explicitly to demonstrate British scientific leadership to a domestic and international audience, arranged deliberately on geological islands meant to walk visitors chronologically through the history of life on Earth, as though that history were as legible and as manageable as a well-kept ledger. The confidence was genuine. It was also, in the specific case of the Iguanodon's thumb spike, mistaken for a nose horn, and the quadrupedal posture, later fossil discoveries, would substantially correct, considerably ahead of what the actual evidence could support. The 3 dinosaurs, Iguanodon, Megalosaurus, and Hylaeosaurus, were only part of a considerably larger menagerie arranged around the geological islands. Detailed, the popular shorthand of Dinosaur Park tends to flatten out of the story entirely. Visitors that June morning could also walk past reconstructed ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, marine reptiles rendered with paddle limbs and long serpentine necks, arranged along the shoreline of what the park's designers labeled the secondary island to represent an earlier chapter of prehistoric life than the dinosaurs themselves. Further along, the tertiary island offered an entirely different cast of extinct creatures. Giant ground sloths, an enormous fossil relative of the armadillo, and the towering antlers of the Irish elk. Animals considerably closer to the present in geological terms, and considerably less alien to a Victorian eye already familiar with elephants and large deer from illustrated natural histories and traveling menageries. The whole arrangement was designed to walk a visitor physically through several 100 million years of the Earth's history in the space of a single afternoon stroll, an ambitious piece of public science education for a period when the very concept of deep geological time remained difficult and somewhat unsettling new idea to absorb. For Josiah, walking his family past the iguanodon that afternoon, none of this theoretical context registered in any explicit form, though something like it lived in his hands in a more practical, embodied way. He had built the animal according to specifications that changed more than once over the winter, as Hawkins and Owen revised their thinking about a particular joint or the correct thickness of a limb, and he had absorbed the basic lesson that even the most confidently presented scientific fact could still be, underneath its finished surface, a kind of educated guess dressed up in painted cement. When a fellow visitor near the rail remarked admiringly that the animals must be exactly as they had looked when alive, precisely as science had determined, Josiah said nothing, though he recalled distinctly at least 1 week in February when the shape of that very same nose horn had been remade twice within a matter of days. Down from the modelers to the men mixing the cement. This is not a detail most people watching the animals that day would have any way of knowing, and it changes the picture considerably. The Crystal Palace iguanodon was not a faithful window onto the deep past so much as a confident, carefully argued, and ultimately mistaken snapshot of what one brilliant Victorian anatomist, working within the scientific and theological assumptions of his own era, believed the deep past most likely looked like. Later, discoveries, particularly a spectacular find of dozens of complete iguanodon skeletons in a Belgian coal mine in 1878, would demonstrate conclusively that the animal walked at least partly on 2 legs, carried its tail well clear of the ground, and wore its supposed nose horn on its thumb instead. Findings that arrived roughly a quarter century too late to save the Sydenham reconstructions from becoming, within the lifetime of some of the very visitors admiring them, that June, a monument to scientific confidence outrunning scientific evidence. The quiet observation worth sitting with here is that the crowd's wonder was not in any sense foolish or misplaced. The animals were and remain a genuine achievement of scale, craftsmanship, and public science communication, the first attempt anywhere in the world to render extinct creatures at true size for a general audience rather than confining them to diagrams and museum cases. But the particular certainty on display, the sense radiating from every information board and newspaper account that this was simply what the ancient world had looked like, settled and confirmed, was itself a distinctly Victorian performance, and time alike. The animals were magnificent. They were also, in the most literal sense, wrong, and nobody standing at the rail that June morning, Josiah included, had any way of knowing exactly how wrong, or in which specific places. For Josiah, meanwhile, the animals presented a different kind of hidden reality entirely, one that lived not in the theory behind their shape, but in the physical substance of the materials that had gone into building them, and in what 9 months of handling those materials had actually done to his own body. If you imagine the construction of a Victorian public monument, you probably picture stonework, careful masonry, perhaps some decorative ironwork, materials that read today as solid, durable, and essentially inert. The Crystal Palace animals were built from something considerably less simple, a combination of brick, roofing, tile, and iron hooping, forming an internal skeleton over which layers of mortar and cement were applied and shaped by hand to create the animal's final external form. The whole surface, then finished with paint and varnish designed to weather outdoor exposure, while presenting a convincingly lifelike color and texture. One iguanodon alone required something in the range of 600 bricks, 1,500 roofing tiles, and well over 100 casks of cement and broken stone, quantities that meant Hawkins' workshop functioned, for the better part of a year, less like an artist's studio and more like a small, specialized construction site. Staffed by exactly the kind of manual laborers Josiah represented. What working in that environment actually involved was daily, sustained exposure to a set of materials that Victorian science understood only partially. Cement dust, raised constantly by mixing and shaping the wet mortar mixture in bulk, filled the workshop air in a fine grit that settled into the lungs, throat, and eyes of every man working there, producing a persistent cough and chronic eye irritation that laborers of the period generally accepted as simply an unavoidable feature of the trade, rather than a symptom worth reporting to anyone in a position to address it. Lime, a key ingredient in the mortar mixture, caused chemical burns on unprotected skin that came into prolonged contact with it, a hazard well known among bricklayers of the period, even without any formal understanding of the underlying chemistry. And Josiah, like most of his fellow workmen, discolored skin on his forearms and hands as a direct physical record of exactly this exposure. The paint applied to the finished animals introduced a further, and in some respects, more serious hazard. Victorian paint of nearly every color and application, from domestic house paint to the specialized weatherproof coatings used on outdoor ironwork and masonry, relied overwhelmingly on white lead as its primary base, a pigment prized for its exceptional opacity, durability, and resistance to the elements. Exactly the properties a set of outdoor monuments intended to survive decades of English weather would have required. Lead-based paint of this kind was applied throughout Victorian Britain, with essentially no safety precaution whatsoever, since the specific neurological and systemic dangers of lead exposure, though suspected by some physicians of the period in occupational contexts like plumbing and painting, would not be fully understood or seriously acted upon for decades to come. Green pigments of the era carried their own separate hazard, since the vivid popular shade known as Scheele's green and its more stable successor emerald green were manufactured using copper arsenite, meaning any green coloring used in the animal's finish, whether applied to foliage details or reptiles' own hides, likely introduced a measurable quantity of arsenic directly into the workshop environment as well, absorbed through repeated skin contact and inhaled in trace amounts whenever the paint was mixed, sanded, or touched up. None of the men working in Hawkins' workshop wore what a modern observer would recognize as protective equipment of any kind. Gloves, where used at all, were ordinary leatherwork gloves offering essentially no barrier against fine particulate lead or arsenic compounds, and ventilation in the workshop depended entirely on open doors and windows rather than any deliberate system for clearing airborne dust and fumes. Josiah spent the better part of 9 months handling cement, lime, and lead-based paint on a near-daily basis, in an environment where the specific danger of any single substance was, at most, only dimly understood by anyone present, and where the cumulative effect of repeated exposure across an entire working season was not a subject anyone involved had any real occasion to consider. By the spring of 1854, Josiah had developed a set of complaints that he attributed in the vague and largely uninvestigated language available to a working man of his period, simply to the demands of hard physical labor, persistent fatigue that did not fully resolve with rest, occasional stomach discomfort, a certain heaviness, lack of sharpness in his own thinking that he might, in another era, have recognized as worth mentioning to a physician. These are symptoms consistent in the retrospective judgment of modern occupational medicine, with mild to moderate lead exposure, though it would be inaccurate and unhelpfully dramatic to claim with certainty that Josiah, specifically, what can be said with confidence based on well-established Victorian labour and public health scholarship is that a workforce of the kind employed on this project would have experienced measurable cumulative lead and arsenic exposure as an ordinary and entirely unremarked feature of the job. A background hazard woven into the physical experience of building something meant to look permanent, solid, and entirely safe to the public that would later come to admire it. The historian Liza Picard, whose research into the material texture of Victorian London draws extensively on period trade manuals, medical case notes, and household records, has documented how thoroughly lead-based paint and pigment-saturated everyday Victorian life, used not only in industrial and construction settings like Hawkins' workshop, but in domestic house paint, children's toys, and even, in certain notorious cases, cosmetics and confectionery coloring. The specific danger to construction laborers handling large quantities of lead paint over extended periods, though occasionally noted by individual physicians treating painters and plumbers for what was sometimes called painter's colic, remained outside the scope of any meaningful regulation or workplace protection until considerably later in the century. And even then, only partially. Josiah's exposure, in this sense, was neither exceptional nor especially newsworthy by the standards of his own moment. It was simply what building something durable and weatherproof required, absorbed quietly into the bodies of the men who did the actual building, exactly the way the cement dust and lime burns had been. Meaningful legal protection for workers in trades like Josiah's remained in 1854, a matter for the future rather than the present. The Factory Acts, already on the books, regulated hours and conditions in textile mills with some rigor, a response to decades of organized reform pressure focused specifically on that industry. But construction and comprehensive workplace safety legislation covering lead and arsenic exposure across British industry generally would not arrive for several more decades. A laborer in Josiah's position had, in practice, no legal right to protective equipment, no mandated ventilation standard, and no established mechanism for reporting or seeking compensation for an illness he could not have proven in any case. Traced specifically back to his employer, rather than to the general hazards of manual labor in an industrial age that exposed nearly everyone, in one trade or another, to some comparable substance. Standing now at the rail beside the finished, fully painted iguanodon his family had come to see, Josiah felt none of this as acute pain or obvious illness. He felt, if anything, a certain private, complicated pride in the animal's finished surface, the smooth grey-brown skin that gave no outward sign of the raw lime and lead and cement dust that had gone into producing it. A pride entirely compatible, in his own understanding, with the persistent low-grade fatigue he had carried since roughly the previous February, and attributed without much further thought simply to a hard winter's work honestly done. The paint had cured beautifully. The color held exactly the tone Owen and Hawkins had specified. Whatever the same paint might have quietly done to Josiah's own body over 9 months of close daily contact was not a question the finished animal, or the delighted crowd, now admiring it, had any particular reason to ask. Which brings us to a fear that had nothing to do with the animals at all, everything to do with the water they were standing in. If you imagine a Victorian family strolling past an ornamental lake on a summer afternoon, you probably picture a pleasant, faintly romantic scene, still water reflecting the sky, perhaps a few ducks, nothing that would register to a modern eye as a source of genuine anxiety. To the crowd walking the paths around the Sydenham Lake in June of 1854, that same still water carried an entirely different emotional charge, one rooted in a set of medical beliefs that shaped almost every aspect of how Victorians understood illness. And that happened, that very same summer, to be undergoing the most serious challenge they had yet faced. What most Victorians believed, doctors and laypeople alike, was that disease travelled primarily through the air itself, carried in a form of contamination popularly called miasma, an invisible vapour rising from decaying organic matter, standing water, sewage. Under this theory, a bad smell was not simply unpleasant. It was a genuine warning sign, direct sensory evidence that dangerous, disease-bearing air was actively present and actively threatening anyone who breathed it. Stagnant water, of exactly the kind now filling the newly constructed lake at Sydenham, dug and filled only months before the opening, and not yet fully settled into a clean, balanced ecosystem, would have carried precisely the kind of faint, organic, slightly sulfurous odor that miasma theory taught an entire generation to fear. This fear was not abstract or old-fashioned superstition by 1854. It was current, urgent, and about to be proven catastrophically justified in one specific London neighbourhood, though not for the reason miasma theory itself predicted. That very same summer, in the weeks following the Crystal Palace opening, a severe cholera outbreak struck the Soho district of London, killing more than 500 people within roughly 10 days in late August and early September. The physician John Snow, already skeptical of the prevailing miasma explanation, painstakingly mapped the deaths against a single water pump on Broad Street and demonstrated, against considerable initial resistance from local authorities, that the outbreak traced not to bad air at all, but to sewage-contaminated water drawn from that specific pump. Snow's investigation would eventually become one of the founding case studies of modern epidemiology. But in the summer of 1854 itself, his waterborne theory of cholera transmission remained a minority position, contested and largely unaccepted by the medical establishment, while the older, no more intuitive belief in poisoned air continued to shape how ordinary Londoners, including everyone walking the paths at Sydenham, understood their own risk of illness. For a family visiting the new Crystal Palace grounds that June, this meant the ornamental lake surrounding the Dinosaur Islands was not a purely decorative backdrop to the spectacle. It was a source of genuine physically felt unease, particularly on a warm, still day, when the water's surface odor would have carried further and lingered longer in the heavy summer air. Visitors of the period commonly carried small bottles of scent or pressed handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or lavender water against their faces near any source of standing water or crowded, poorly ventilated space. A practical folk remedy against miasma that had no actual protective value against waterborne illness, but that nonetheless offered real psychological comfort to people who had been taught since childhood to treat a bad smell as a direct physical threat to their survival. Harriet, walking the lakeside path with Alfred balanced on her hip, found herself instinctively holding her breath for a few paces wherever the path ran closest to the water's edge. A habit so automatic, she likely could not have explained exactly when or why she had first developed it. She was not being irrational by the standards of her own era. She was behaving exactly as any reasonably careful Victorian mother would have behaved, applying the best available public health knowledge of her day to protect her son from a threat she had every reason to believe was real and immediate. The tragedy, in retrospect, is not that Harriet was foolish to fear the lake. It is that the actual danger, when it eventually arrived that same summer in Soho, would come from a source miasma theory had trained an entire generation to overlook entirely, not the smell in the air, but the water itself, drawn quietly from a pump that gave no warning odor at all. The broader context here says something important about how Victorian society experienced the relationship between its own senses and its own safety. Miasma theory was not simply bad science accepted through ignorance. It was, in its own terms, a reasonably coherent framework built on genuine observed correlations, since areas with poor sanitation, standing water, and pervasive foul odors did correlate strongly with higher disease rates, for reasons the theory correctly identified even while misunderstanding the actual mechanism involved. The historian Judith Flounders has written about how deeply this belief shaped everyday Victorian behavior. From the design of hospital wards, to the placement of graveyards, to the routine domestic practice of airing rooms and burning scented substances against suspected contamination. A whole civilization organizing its instinctive sense of danger around the wrong sensory cue, with tragic consequences that would not be fully corrected until germ theory gained proper acceptance decades later. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Josiah, Harriet, and every other visitor walking those lakeside paths that June carried a perfectly rational, evidence-based fear of exactly the wrong threat, while the actual mechanism of the era's deadliest disease sat waiting, odorless and invisible. Want in ordinary drinking water only a few miles away in Soho, the dinosaurs across the lake represented, in their own imperfect way, the outer edge of what Victorian science could confidently reconstruct from incomplete evidence. The water beneath them represented something else entirely. A genuine present danger that the era's best available framework for understanding disease was, for reasons nobody at the rail that day could have possibly anticipated, still fundamentally unable to see clearly. For a crowd this frightened of foul air, the actual sanitary arrangements waiting for them inside the grounds were, in a phrase Josiah himself would never have used, but that fits the situation exactly, a considerable problem hiding in plain sight. If you imagine the facilities available at a major Victorian public attraction, you might reasonably assume that an operation grand enough to rebuild an entire Crystal Palace, stock it with life-sized prehistoric monsters, and sell tickets to tens of thousands of visitors in a single day would have given equally serious thought to the basic question of where all those visitors might relieve themselves over the course of an extended outing. The actual arrangements at Sydenham in June of 1854 fell considerably short of that assumption, reflecting a broader pattern across Victorian public life in which sanitary infrastructure, particularly for large mixed crowds of men, women, and children. Public conveniences of any kind were scarce across London and its surrounding districts in this period, and where they did exist, they were typically limited, poorly maintained, and frequently restricted by unspoken class and gender convention as to who might reasonably use them. The Crystal Palace Company, having invested enormous sums in the glass structure itself, the ornamental gardens, the fountains, and the geological islands, had allocated comparatively little planning toward the specific challenge of managing bodily waste for a crowd numbering in the tens of thousands. Gap that became immediately and unpleasantly obvious once the grounds actually filled to capacity. Facilities that did exist were quickly overwhelmed, queues formed and lengthened as the day wore on, and a significant portion of visitors, particularly those unwilling to abandon their place in a crowd or unable to locate adequate facilities at all, simply endured considerable discomfort rather than risk the social embarrassment of a visible search for relief in a public setting surrounded by strangers. For women in particular, the situation carried an additional layer of difficulty. Victorian female dress, with its multiple layers of petticoat, corsetry, and structured skirt, made the basic physical logistics of using any sanitary facility considerably more time-consuming and difficult than it would have been for a man, a fact that compounded every delay caused by inadequate facility numbers. Mothers managing small children faced a further complication, since a toddler like Alfred operated on a schedule entirely indifferent to the availability of appropriate facilities, and Harriet, like countless mothers around her that day, found herself making a series of increasingly difficult calculations about timing, location, and the diminishing patience of a small child who did not understand or particularly care why the day's plan kept being interrupted by an urgent search for somewhere, anywhere, reasonably private. The consequence of all this, spread across a crowd of 40,000 people concentrated on a single hillside over a single day, was a set of conditions the fastidious Victorian sensibility would have found deeply difficult to acknowledge directly, even as everyone present experienced some version of it firsthand. Inadequate facilities meant, inevitably, informal and improvised solutions in less visible corners of the grounds, particularly as the day wore on, and both the crowd's numbers and its collective discomfort continued to build. Combined with summer heat, closely packed bodies, and a general absence of the kind of routine washing facilities modern venues take for granted, the overall atmosphere in the more crowded sections of the park by mid-afternoon carried a distinctly unpleasant undertone that no quantity of ornamental flower beds. Visitors, sensitive to precisely the kind of foul odor miasma theory had trained them to fear, found themselves, with considerable irony, standing in the middle of exactly the kind of concentrated human waste and crowding that even the era's imperfect medical understanding correctly associated with elevated disease risk. Whatever its beliefs about the specific mechanism involved, Josiah, more accustomed than his wife to enduring exactly this kind of physical discomfort without much outward complaint, found the afternoon's growing crowding and its accompanying atmosphere simply another item on a long list of minor miseries. Harriet found it considerably harder to manage gracefully, caught between her genuine desire to give her son a pleasant, memorable day and the mounting difficulty of keeping him comfortable, clean, and reasonably content in conditions that grew steadily less accommodating as the afternoon wore toward its peak, crowding around 2 and 3 o'clock. More than once she found herself retreating toward the edges of the grounds, away from the densest crowds near the lake, simply to find a few minutes of comparatively fresh air and a moment to attend to Alfred. Away from public view. Small, private retreats that cost the family time they had not planned to spend, and that no handbill advertising the day's attractions had thought to mention as a likely necessity. Class shaped this particular hazard as directly as it shaped almost everything else about the day. Season ticket holders and the wealthier patrons who had subscribed to private boxes and reserved areas inside the palace itself had access to a smaller number of considerably better maintained facilities, tucked away from the general public paths and rarely mentioned in the promotional literature aimed at a broader audience. Since acknowledging their existence openly would have meant acknowledging, just as openly, how little had been provided for everyone else. A visitor of Harriet's background had no reasonable way of even knowing such facilities existed, let alone any expectation of being permitted to use them had she known, and so the search for relief that occupied a meaningful portion of her afternoon. Dawn remarked marker of exactly where her family stood in the day's larger social arrangement. The broader context here connects directly to a set of public health reforms that were, in 1854, still very much in progress rather than completed. The sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick had spent the preceding decade documenting, in exhaustive and frequently horrifying detail, the connection between inadequate sanitation and disease in Britain's rapidly growing cities, and his advocacy had begun, slowly, to shift public and official opinion toward the idea that basic sanitary infrastructure represented a legitimate matter of state concern rather than a private problem for individual households and property owners to solve on their own. But that shift remained incomplete in 1854, years before London's comprehensive sewer system would begin construction under the engineer Joseph Bazalgette, following the notorious Great Stink of 1858 and a major new public attraction like the Crystal Palace reflected the sanitary priorities of its moment, rather than anticipating the reforms still several years away. The historian Liza Picard has documented how thoroughly this gap between grand public ambition and basic sanitary provision characterized Victorian civic life more broadly, a pattern in which enormous sums were readily found for monuments and displays of national confidence, while the unglamorous infrastructure of daily bodily need was consistently underfunded, and in mixed public settings especially, barely considered at all. There is a particular kind of irony worth noting here, one that would not have been lost on a more cynical observer than either Josiah or Harriet was inclined to be that afternoon. A crowd honestly frightened of invisible airborne contamination rising from stagnant water spent its day standing in conditions that produced exactly the kind of concentrated, poorly managed human waste that even contemporary medical opinion recognized as dangerous, while remaining largely unbothered by the specific arrangement. Since the danger they had been trained to fear and the danger actually surrounding them simply did not match up in their own understanding. Crystal Palace had been built to project Victorian mastery over nature, history, and the deep past all at once. It had not, in its opening season, been built with anywhere near the same care to manage the considerably more immediate and mundane demands of the ordinary bodies it was inviting in such enormous numbers to come and stand in front of it. There is one more physical hazard worth walking through carefully, because it is the one that came closest to actually alarming Josiah that day, and it had nothing to do with paint, water, or plumbing at all. It had to do with simple crowd physics, and with a park layout that had not been designed with a crowd this size in mind. The geological islands holding the reconstructed animals had been laid out, in the original design, as a sequence meant to be viewed primarily from small boats crossing the lake, allowing visitors an unhurried, well-spaced view of each creature from multiple angles as they drifted past. Cost and construction timelines had compressed that original vision considerably by the time the park actually opened, leaving most visitors to view the animals instead from a network of footpaths and viewing points connected by iron railings meant to keep the crowd safely back from the water while still allowing a reasonably close vantage of each reconstruction. These viewing points, particularly the spots offering the clearest sight line toward the most popular animals, the iguanodon especially, were narrow by design and utterly unprepared for the volume of visitors now attempting to use them simultaneously. If you picture a crowd viewing a popular attraction, you probably picture something orderly enough, visitors taking their turn, moving along at a reasonable pace, no one lingering long enough to create a genuine bottleneck. What actually happened at several of these viewing points over the course of the day was considerably less orderly. As word spread through the crowd about which vantage point offered the best view of a particular animal, visitors converged on that spot from multiple directions at once, and the narrow path, designed for a comfortable trickle of boat passengers rather than a determined crush of pedestrians, simply could not accommodate the resulting pressure. Visitors already at the rail found themselves pressed forward against the iron railing by the weight of the crowd building up behind them, unable to step back or move aside without physically fighting against the press of bodies on every side, while those further back unable to see anything at all. Pushed forward in the entirely understandable hope of eventually reaching a clear view themselves. The iron railings themselves, sturdy enough for their intended purpose of keeping individual visitors safely back from the water's edge, had not been engineered to bear the sustained lateral pressure of dozens of adult bodies leaning into them at once, and reports from the period describe sections of railing bending, and in at least some documented instances giving way outright, under exactly this kind of crowd pressure, spilling visitors toward the water's edge in a sudden, frightening lurch that could easily have ended in serious injury or worse had the water itself been deeper or the fall from the bank more severe. The gravel banks surrounding several of the geological islands, laid down quickly and not yet fully compacted or stabilized by root growth or long-term settling, proved similarly unstable underfoot for visitors who found themselves pushed off the main path and onto the loose margin beside it. A genuine hazard for anyone in the tightly laced boots and long skirts that made a sudden loss of footing considerably harder to recover from gracefully. For Josiah's family, the worst of this crush arrived in the early afternoon near the most popular viewing point for the iguanodon itself, the very animal Josiah had spent 9 months helping to build. Harriet, with Alfred held tightly against her chest, found herself caught in a sudden forward surge as a fresh wave of visitors arrived from the direction of the refreshment rooms, the crowd around her compressing so quickly and so completely that for several long, frightening seconds she could not move her arms freely enough. Could feel the press of strangers' shoulders and elbows from every direction at once, and experienced, however briefly, the specific and deeply unpleasant sensation of being physically unable to control her own movement or her child's safety in a crowd that had, without any single person intending it, become something close to dangerous. Josiah, a step behind her in the crush, used his own shoulder and forearm to force a narrow channel of space, the kind of practiced physical assertion a laborer's frame made possible in a way it would not have been for many of the more delicately built gentlemen, also caught in the same crowd, and managed to pull his wife and son sideways out of the densest part of the surge before the moment resolved itself, the way most such moments did that day, not in catastrophe, but in a slow, grudging dispersal as the crowd's pressure gradually eased and people found, at last, a little more room to breathe. Nobody in Josiah's family was seriously hurt that afternoon, and in this they were fortunate rather than unusual, since the great majority of visitors who experienced a similar crush at Sydenham that summer came away with nothing worse than bruises, torn clothing, and a considerably shaken sense of how quickly an afternoon of quiet family wonder could tip, for a handful of frightening seconds, into something closer to genuine physical danger. Newspaper accounts and later institutional records do describe injuries at the Crystal Palace grounds during its early, heavily attended seasons, including incidents involving crowd crush, falls from unstable ground, and mishaps around the water's edge. Though systematic public record-keeping of exactly this kind of minor injury remained, in 1854, considerably less thorough than it would become in later decades, leaving the full scale of the problem harder to document precisely than a modern observer might wish. What can be said with confidence is that the basic infrastructure meant to manage tens of thousands of bodies moving through a constrained physical space simply had not caught up in June of 1854 to the scale of public appetite the Crystal Palace Company had itself successfully generated. The animals had been engineered with painstaking care. The paths, railings, and viewing points surrounding them had not received anywhere near the same attention, a gap that reflected in miniature a broader pattern of the era, enormous confidence and genuine skill applied to the spectacle itself, considerably less applied to the unglamorous, entirely predictable question of how a crowd that size would actually need to move, stand, breathe, and stay upright while looking at it. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what the whole of this day would actually have smelled like, because smell, more than any single fact already covered, is the sense that would have told the visitor most clearly how far this afternoon had drifted from the picture on the handbills. If you imagine the air around a grand Victorian pleasure garden, you probably imagine something floral and pleasant. Cut grass, perhaps a hint of coal smoke from a distant train, nothing especially remarkable. The actual atmosphere drifting across the Sydenham grounds by mid-afternoon on the 10th of June was considerably more complicated than that, a layered, shifting mixture that changed depending on where in the park a visitor happened to be standing. Nearest the lake, the dominant note was the faint, organic smell of new standing water, not yet fully settled after its winter filling, carrying the mild sulphurous undertone that had convinced Harriet and thousands like her, to hold their breath instinctively along certain stretches of path. Moving away from the water and into the denser crowds near the most popular viewing points, that smell gave way to something considerably closer to what any large gathering of Victorian bodies produced on a hot day: wet wool, warmed by hours of direct sun, and trapped body heat carrying its own distinct, slightly animal odor that no amount of careful laundering the previous evening could have prevented once the fabric had spent several hours absorbing sweat in close crowded conditions. Add to that the sharper, more chemical scent of fresh paint and varnish still curing on portions of the animals and their surrounding ironwork. A smell visitors frequently commented on in surviving accounts of the opening season, faintly acrid and unmistakably artificial against the more organic smell surrounding it. And the overall effect near any of the more crowded viewing points would have been something far removed from the pleasant, flower-scented outing the day's advertising had promised. Closer to the areas where sanitary facilities had proven inadequate to demand, the smell sharpened further into something considerably less ambiguous, an undertone of human waste that the crowd worked hard, largely without acknowledging it directly to one another, to walk quickly past or breathe through as shallowly as possible. And running beneath all of it, present everywhere on the grounds, regardless of specific location, was the general smell of a very large number of human bodies engaged in a full day of walking, standing, and waiting in close proximity to one another, a smell every visitor present was simultaneously producing and enduring. Whatever its elaborate rules about outward presentation had comparatively few reliable tools for managing body odor across an entire hot summer day spent almost entirely without access to washing facilities. This sensory reality connects directly to a broader truth about the physical experience of working-class Victorian leisure that rarely survives in the cheerful engravings and newspaper illustrations produced to commemorate days like this one. Those images show families strolling comfortably along wide, uncrowded paths, animals rendered in crisp, confident detail, the whole scene bathed in a soft, idealized light that erases almost every element of physical discomfort a real visitor would have actually experienced. The living history work of researchers like Ruth Goodman, who has spent considerable time recreating the physical realities of ordinary Victorian daily life, rather than relying solely on its official visual record, points consistently toward the same conclusion. The gap between how the Victorian middle class chose to depict its own leisure and how that leisure actually felt in the body was often considerable, particularly for visitors from working households whose physical stamina was already being drawn on heavily by the ordinary demands of their daily labor before they ever set foot inside a pleasure garden. For Josiah's family specifically, the accumulated physical toll of the day had become undeniable by mid to late afternoon. Alfred, exhausted past the point of good humor, had fallen into the particular heavy, overheated sleep small children reach only after several hours of overstimulation, carried now against his father's shoulder rather than his mother's. Since Harriet's own arms had begun to shake slightly from hours of intermittent carrying combined with the ongoing restriction of her corset. Neither Josiah nor Harriet had managed to find clean drinking water since arriving that morning. Refreshment stalls inside the grounds, charging prices that placed them well outside a working family's reasonable daily budget, and the mild, persistent headache that comes with hours of physical exertion in summer heat without adequate fluid had settled over both adults by the time the crowd around them began, gradually, to thin toward the day's later hours. The broader context worth naming plainly here is that a day like this one, marketed and remembered as a democratic triumph of Victorian public culture, a spectacle honestly accessible to ordinary working families rather than reserved for the wealthy alone, whose bodies absorbed the heat, the crowding, the thirst, and the exhaustion, in a way that wealthier visitors, with their private carriages, their shaded refreshment rooms, and their considerably lighter summer wardrobes, experienced in a substantially milder form. The Crystal Palace Company had, in a real and meaningful sense, opened one of the great wonders of the age to nearly anyone who could scrape together the price of admission. It had done considerably less to ensure that the bodies making that journey, walking those miles, and standing in that heat would be properly cared for once they arrived. And the difference between those two achievements was carried quietly, and almost entirely without official comment, in the aching feet, parched throats, and sun-flushed faces of exactly the visitors the day was supposedly designed to welcome most warmly. There is something worth pausing on here before we step back to look at the whole of this day together. The wonder was real. The exhaustion was equally real, running alongside it the entire time in the same bodies, over the same hours, largely unremarked upon because Victorian public life offered so few socially acceptable ways to voice that particular kind of ordinary, undramatic physical suffering out loud. For Josiah's household, that difference in experience began well before the first ache of the afternoon. In a set of financial calculations most wealthier visitors to Sydenham never had cause to make at all. If you imagine the cost of a Victorian day out, you probably picture the price of the ticket itself as the main expense, a single sum a family either could or could not afford, with the day's enjoyment following automatically once that one barrier had been cleared. The actual arithmetic facing a household like Josiah's was considerably more layered than that, involving a series of smaller, compounding costs that together made a single family outing represent a meaningfully larger portion of the household's resources. Admission to the grounds themselves was priced deliberately to widen access beyond the wealthy alone, with cheaper days offered on a rotating schedule specifically to draw in exactly the kind of working household Josiah represented. A genuine and largely successful piece of Victorian civic ambition. But the ticket was only the first expense in a day that also required railway fare for 3 people. Any food or drink purchased inside grounds where prices ran well above what the same items would have cost in an ordinary Bermondsey shop. And less visibly, but perhaps most significantly, a full day's lost wages for Josiah himself. Since a labourer, paid by the day, or the piece earned nothing at all while standing at the rail, admiring an iguanodon he had helped build the previous winter. For a household living close to the margin of its weekly income, as the great majority of London's labouring families did in this period, a single day's lost earnings represented a real and carefully weighed sacrifice, not a minor inconvenience easily absorbed into a comfortable monthly budget. Harriet had managed the household accounts carefully in the weeks leading up to the opening, setting aside small amounts from the family's grocery and coal money to cover the day's combined expenses, a common practice among working households of the period who understood, in granular detail, exactly what a single day's pleasure was going to cost them in terms of a slightly leaner week to follow. This kind of careful, unglamorous financial planning rarely appears in the celebratory newspaper coverage of the Crystal Palace opening. Coverage that tended to emphasize the wonder of the spectacle and the scale of the crowd, rather than the quiet domestic arithmetic that had made each individual family's presence in that crowd possible in the first place. The historian Liza Picard has documented in detail how tightly managed the finances of a Victorian working household typically were, with even modest leisure spending requiring the kind of careful weekly budgeting that wealthier Victorian commentators, writing about the supposed thriftlessness or improvidence of the poor, rarely bothered to understand or acknowledge. For a wealthier family attending the same opening, the day's costs registered altogether differently. A private carriage eliminated the crush and expense of the overcrowded railway. A father's absence from his own business or profession for a single afternoon carried no corresponding loss of wages, since professional and mercantile income in this period was rarely tied so directly and immediately to a single day's physical presence at work, the way a labourer's pay was. Refreshments purchased inside the grounds represented a trivial expense rather than a carefully weighed indulgence. The same admission ticket, purchased by two different families standing at the same rail, admiring the same iguanodon, represented two entirely different financial experiences. One, a comfortable and unremarkable leisure purchase. The other, a carefully planned, meaningfully sacrificial investment of a week's already limited resources. This gap mattered beyond the immediate question of household budgeting, because it shaped, in a real and measurable way, how much of the day's full experience family like Josiah's could actually afford to have. A wealthier visitor, exhausted by the heat, could retreat into one of the shaded refreshment rooms and purchase a cooling drink without a second thought. Josiah and Harriet, having already accounted carefully for the day's necessary expenses, felt the cost of an unplanned lemonade or ice as a real and specific subtraction from money set aside for the following week's needs, a calculation that shaped more than either of them lightly articulated. Exactly how long they were willing to linger in any one spot, how readily they reached for a purchased comfort when their bodies clearly wanted one, and how much of the physical discomfort building steadily across the afternoon they simply chose to absorb rather than spend money to relieve. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the Crystal Palace Company's genuine achievement, opening a spectacle of this scale to working families at all, existed alongside a considerably less discussed reality in which that same access came wrapped a set of financial constraints invisible to the wealthier visitors, sharing the same paths, the same view of the same animals. Democratized wonder, as the opening of the Crystal Palace has often been remembered, was real. It was also, for a family like Josiah's, wonder purchased at the specific and carefully calculated cost of a lighter larder the following week, a lost day's wages that would not be recovered, and a running, silent arithmetic that shadowed every purchase, every rest stop, and every small indulgence considered, and then, more often than not. There is one final piece of this day worth walking through carefully, and it concerns the building itself rather than the animals surrounding it, because the great glass palace at the center of the whole enterprise carried its own quieter set of physical hazards, largely invisible beneath the sheer confidence of its engineering. If you imagine standing inside the Crystal Palace on a bright June afternoon, you probably picture something close to what its many admiring illustrations suggested: soaring, light, cool green plantings, an atmosphere of airy, almost weightless grandeur, entirely different from the crowded, dusty paths outside. The building was, without question, a genuine feat of engineering, designed originally by Joseph Paxton and rebuilt at Sydenham on an even larger scale. Its structure composed of standardized iron framework and hundreds of thousands of panes of glass, assembled with a speed and precision 3 years earlier. But a structure built almost entirely of glass and iron, standing in direct summer sun, behaved rather differently from the airy, temperate ideal its illustration suggested, and visitors who ventured inside its main galleries on the 10th of June discovered this difference for themselves within a matter of minutes. Glass, as any gardener of the period could have explained, traps heat with remarkable efficiency, precisely the quality that made greenhouse construction so useful for cultivating delicate plants through an English winter, and precisely the quality that made a building constructed. Summer heat wave. The interior of the Crystal Palace on a hot June day reached temperatures noticeably higher than the already considerable heat outside, an effect worsened by the sheer number of bodies moving through its galleries at once, each one adding its own small measure of warmth to an already overheated space. Visitors who ducked inside seeking relief from the sun at the dinosaur enclosures often found the interior no more comfortable, and in the most densely visited sections, considerably less so, an ironic inversion of the shelter they had expected to find. The scale of glass involved introduced a second, less commonly discussed hazard as well. A structure built from hundreds of thousands of individual panes, however carefully engineered, was not immune to occasional breakage, whether from settling structural stress, an accidental impact, or simple manufacturing flaws in glass produced at this unprecedented industrial scale, and falling glass fragments. Though addressed with genuine engineering care in the building's design and maintenance routines, remained a background risk that period safety standards managed considerably less rigorously than a modern visitor would expect or tolerate. Contemporary accounts of the Crystal Palace's operation across its decades of use record occasional incidents of exactly this kind, along with more routine concerns about the structural strain placed on iron and glass. Stresses the building's design accounted for in general terms, but could not fully eliminate in practice. For Josiah, who had spent the previous winter working within sight of the palace's construction crews, even while focused on his own task among the dinosaurs, the building represented a source of genuine professional admiration mixed with a laborer's characteristically unsentimental awareness. Engineered structure. He had seen enough of large-scale Victorian construction to know that confidence and safety were not in practice quite the same thing, and he kept Alfred sleeping now against his shoulder, a careful arm's length from the denser crowds gathered beneath the tallest sections of glass roof, a small, private precaution he would have struggled to explain if asked, rooted less in any specific fear than in the accumulated instinct of a man who had spent years around large structures built quickly, ambitiously, and not always with quite as much margin for error as their finished appearance suggested. The broader context here connects to something fairly central about how Victorian Britain understood its own engineering achievements. The Crystal Palace, in both its original and rebuilt forms, was celebrated, correctly, as proof of what industrial-era design and mass production could accomplish. A building of a scale and speed of construction. That celebration, though, tended to treat the building's occasional failures, its overheating galleries, its vulnerability to glass breakage, its dependence on a level of ongoing maintenance few institutions were prepared to sustain indefinitely, as minor footnotes rather than meaningful qualifications to the larger triumph. The building would in the end survive for more than 80 years after this particular June afternoon, standing through decades of changing fortune before a catastrophic fire destroyed it entirely in 1936, a fate that had nothing directly to do with the heat or the glass hazards visitors noticed in 1854. But that nonetheless serves as a useful reminder that even the era's most celebrated monuments to permanence and progress remained, underneath their confident surfaces, considerably more fragile than their admirers preferred to imagine. There is something worth carrying forward from this, standing, as we are near the end of Josiah's long day. The Crystal Palace and the animals surrounding it were both, in their own ways, monuments to a very particular kind of Victorian confidence, the belief that sufficient skill, sufficient ambition, and sufficient capital could master almost any physical or intellectual challenge placed in front of them. That confidence produced real and lasting achievement. It also produced consistently, and almost as a matter of course, a persistent blind spot around the more mundane physical costs of its own success, a blind spot that fell, this particular June afternoon, as on so many others, most heavily on the ordinary bodies standing closest to the ground. Step back now, far enough to see the whole of this day at once, the way you might step back from a large painting to let its individual brushstrokes resolve into a single coherent image, and a handful of patterns emerge that run underneath every single chapter of Josiah's afternoon, connecting the toxic paint to the crowded rail line, the miasma dread to the unstable gravel bank in ways that a visitor standing at any single point along that day would have had no particular reason to notice. The first pattern is the simplest to state and the hardest to fully absorb. Victorian confidence in this particular summer consistently and considerably outran Victorian capacity to protect the ordinary bodies That confidence was built to impress. The same civilization capable of dismantling and rebuilding an entire glass palace, of reconstructing extinct monsters, true scale, from a handful of fossil fragments, of moving railways, capital, and empire across half the globe with genuine and often justified self-assurance, proved considerably less capable of managing something as basic as adequate sanitation for 40,000 visitors, or safe railings along a footpath, or breathable, weather-appropriate clothing for a woman standing in June sun. What? This was not hypocrisy exactly, and it would be a mistake to read it as simple negligence either. It reflects something more structural, an era whose engineering imagination reliably outpaced its instinct for the unglamorous, unphotographed labor of actually caring for the bodies its achievements were meant to serve. The second pattern concerns labor and its erasure, and it connects Josiah's winter in the workshop directly to his own family's afternoon at the rail. The dinosaurs stood finished and admired because a workforce of men whose names went almost entirely unrecorded had spent months absorbing cement dust, lime burns, and lead paint into their own bodies, then walked away from the finished product to make room for the paying public who would never think to ask. That same asymmetry repeated itself in a gentler but still recognizable form across the visiting crowd itself. Working families like Josiah's paid in lost wages and careful budgeting and physical endurance for an experience that wealthier visitors purchased with considerably less bodily cost, riding in private carriages, resting in shaded refreshment rooms, wearing lighter summer fabric that never trapped quite the same heat against the skin. Wonder at the Crystal Palace was honestly democratized, in the sense that access to it had been deliberately widened beyond the wealthy alone. The physical cost of consuming that wonder was democratized considerably less, and it settled, as it so often did across Victorian public life, most heavily on exactly the people with the least financial cushion to absorb it. The third pattern is a matter of perception rather than money, and it is perhaps the strangest one to sit with from this distance. An entire crowd of reasonably intelligent, reasonably careful Victorians spent their day anxiously monitoring the wrong danger. They held their breath near standing mortar and pressed scented handkerchiefs to their faces, applying in good faith the best medical science available to them, while the actual mechanisms of risk that afternoon, waterborne disease invisible in its transmission. An iron railing never engineered for the lateral pressure of a determined crowd, operated entirely outside the sensory framework their era had trained them to trust. This is not a case for smug hindsight at the Victorians' expense. It is a reminder that every era, including our own, builds its sense of safety around whatever mechanisms its best available science can currently detect, and that the gap between perceived danger and actual danger rarely announces itself clearly. And the fourth pattern draws the other three together into something close to a single idea. The animals at Sydenham and the palace surrounding them were an argument delivered in brick and cement and painted plaster about mastery of nature, of deep time, of empire, of the very question of who got to decide what the ancient world had looked like and why it mattered. The performance of that mastery was extraordinary, one of the more remarkable pieces of public science communication the 19th century produced. The machinery behind it, the toxic materials, the underpaid and uncredited labor, the crowd control that never quite caught up with public appetite, the sanitary planning that lagged years behind the era's own reform movements, was considerably less impressive and depended for its persuasive power. Taunton, staying almost entirely invisible to the very crowd it was designed to dazzle. Josiah understood a piece of this instinctively, the way a person understands something through their own body rather than through analysis. without ever having the vocabulary or the leisure to articulate it as a pattern. He had built the mastery. He had also breathed its dust, burned his forearms on its lime, and carried the ordinary, quiet fatigue of 9 months' exposure to materials nobody around him thought to question. Watching his family stand at the rail that afternoon, admiring an animal he alone among the crowd truly understood, down to its hollow, iron-ribbed interior, he occupied a strange and specific vantage point close enough to the machinery of the day's wonder, and invisible enough to that same wonder that not one stranger passing him on the path would ever think to ask. There is something clarifying about naming these patterns plainly, rather than leaving them scattered across 9 separate chapters of specific individual discomfort. The heat, the crush, the toxic paint, the sanitary crisis, the miasma dread, and the unstable railing were not 9 unrelated inconveniences that happened to converge on a single unlucky afternoon. They were the predictable, almost inevitable consequence of a civilization pouring its most sophisticated resources into the visible spectacle of mastery while leaving the invisible infrastructure of ordinary bodily care to develop unevenly and years behind schedule, largely on its own. The wonder was real. So, running quietly underneath it the entire time was the cost of producing and consuming that wonder, a cost that fell this particular June, as on so many others, hardest on the people standing closest to the ground. By early evening, with the sun finally beginning its long, slow descent toward the horizon, and the worst heat of the day easing into something more tolerable, Josiah's family joined the equally exhausted river of visitors, making their way back toward the railway station. Final chapter of exactly what this day had actually cost the bodies who had lived through it. Alfred slept the whole way, a heavy, boneless sleep that only a thoroughly overstimulated toddler achieves, his small face still faintly flushed from the day's heat, one shoe, inevitably, missing entirely, lost somewhere among the crowds near the lake and never recovered. Harriet carried him for the first stretch of the walk before Josiah took over his own arms and back, aching from a day spent standing, walking, and briefly bracing against a crowd surge that had come closer to real danger than either of them had said aloud to the other. Her corset, laced that morning with such careful attention, had loosened slightly over the course of the day as she shifted and adjusted against its restriction without quite realizing she was doing it, and she found herself, for the first time since leaving home before dawn, able to take something closer to a full, unrestricted breath. A small mercy she registered gratefully without any particular resentment toward the garment itself, since resentment was not, in her own understanding of her body and her world, really the point. The crowd, moving back toward the station, carried a noticeably different character than the eager, anticipatory mass that had arrived that morning. Conversations ran quieter, paces slower, the earlier chatter about which animal looked most impressive, replaced now by a quieter, more subdued focus on simply reaching home before full dark. Dust from the day's traffic still hung in the evening air along the road, catching the low golden light in a way that would have looked, to anyone not currently breathing it, rather beautiful. Josiah noticed the iguanodon one final time as the path curved past the lake on its way toward the gate, the animal's cement flank catching the same evening light, patient and unmoving in a way that made the whole exhausting, complicated day. He had built that. Whatever the day had cost his body, his wife's comfort, and his family's careful weekly budget, the animal itself remained standing exactly where he had helped put it, and would, as it happened, go on standing for considerably longer than he or anyone in his family would live to see. The train home ran nearly as crowded as the mornings had been, though quieter, filled with families in roughly the same state as Josiah's, sunburned, footsore, thirsty, and largely content in the particular, complicated way that comes from having survived a long and demanding day. Harriet, holding Alfred's small missing shootfoot gently in her lap for the remainder of the journey, found herself already composing, without quite meaning to, the version of the day she would tell her own mother the following week. The size of the animals, the crowds, the heat, framed as adventure rather than ordeal, because that was, in her own understanding of what a good day out was supposed to sound like when retold, the correct and appropriate way to remember it. She was not lying. She had, honestly and by her own account, had a wonderful day, one she would speak of for years afterward, with real warmth. The exhaustion, the fear in the crush near the rail, the ache in her ribs, and the several unplanned trips made in search of privacy she never found, would simply not make it into that retelling, not out of any deliberate concealment, but because Victorian conversational convention, much like the corset itself, had never really provided room for those particular details to be spoken aloud in polite company. Josiah said little on the journey home, watching the darkening fields past the window and turning over, in his own unhurried way, the specific private knowledge that separated his experience of the day from everyone else's in the carriage around him. He had spent the morning admiring, alongside strangers, an animal built from his own months of labor. He had spent the afternoon protecting his family from a crush that could easily have gone worse than it did, in a park whose paths had never been designed to hold the crowd now filling every carriage of this train. He would go back to ordinary bricklaying work the following Monday. The Crystal Palace chapter of his working life now closed. The animals he had helped raise left standing at Sydenham to be admired, for decades to come, by visitors who would never think to wonder whose hands had actually built them. There is a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a body at the end of a day like this one, not the sharp, localized ache of a single injury, but a diffuse, whole-body fatigue that touches the feet, the back, the eyes, and something less easily located besides. A fatigue that would be entirely familiar to anyone who has ever spent a long day being delighted and depleted in more or less equal measure. Josiah, Harriet, and Alfred carried that fatigue home with them on the evening of the 10th of June, 1854, along with a handful of vivid memories, a missing small shoe, and a story that would be told in the family's own retelling. Return now to the lake at Sydenham on the morning of the 10th of June, 1854, to the image this evening opened with the glass flat water, the sun climbing toward a genuine summer heat, and a young family standing at the iron rail, dressed in their good clothes. Looking across the reeds at 30 feet of grey-brown reptile crouched patiently on legs like tree trunks. Look at it again, now, with everything you have learned about what that morning actually contained. The young woman at the rail, one hand pressed to her bonnet, is not simply admiring the view. She is standing inside a corset that has already begun restricting her breathing in a wool dress chosen for durability rather than comfort, having walked 2 dusty miles in shoes built for standing rather than distance, carrying a small son who will, within a few hours, lose a shoe somewhere near this very spot. Overheated sleep of a child pushed well past his limit. She has not yet found a moment of genuine privacy since leaving home before dawn, and she will not find one for several hours more. She is also, by her own honest account, having a wonderful day, and there is no contradiction in that. Both things are true of her at once, the same body standing at the same rail. The young man beside her is not merely another spectator. He spent 9 months of the previous winter with his hands inside the very animal his family has come to admire, mixing the cement that fills its hollow legs, absorbing lime burns into his forearms, and a fine daily dusting of lead paint into his lungs and skin. Standing exactly outside its curved cement wall on New Year's Eve, while 21 of England's most eminent scientific gentlemen died inside it by lamplight. He carries a low, persistent fatigue he has never thought to name as anything more specific than the ordinary cost of hard work honestly done. He also carries, quietly and without any bitterness he would recognize as bitterness, a private knowledge that separates him from every other visitor at this rail. He alone understands that the confident, finished, permanent-looking animal in front of him began as an argument, a guess, a series of revised opinions worked out over months by men who were doing their genuine best with incomplete evidence, and that the certainty radiating from every information board on the grounds is itself a kind of performance, no less impressive for being, in places, quietly wrong. Behind this family and around them, and pressing in from every direction along the crowded paths, are 39,998 other Victorians, each carrying some version of the same day inside a body the handbills never once mentioned. Somewhere in that crowd, other mothers are holding their breath near the water's edge, trusting a theory of disease that will, this same summer, fail catastrophically to explain an outbreak unfolding a few miles north in Soho, even as it succeeds in making an entire population anxious about precisely the wrong danger. Somewhere in that crowd, other families are calculating, in the same careful, largely silent arithmetic Harriet has been running all day, exactly how much a purchased lemonade is worth against the following week's grocery money. Somewhere along the lake's edge, a section of iron railing is bending, almost imperceptibly, under the accumulated weight of visitors leaning forward for a better view in a design nobody thought to test against a crowd of this size. And somewhere inside the vast glass galleries rising behind them all, the temperature is climbing well past anything the day's polite illustrations would ever think to depict, sunlight trapped and multiplied by a structure built brilliantly and a little recklessly almost entirely out of panes of glass. None of this diminishes what these 40,000 people actually witnessed that day, and it would be a mistake to walk away from this account thinking of the Crystal Palace dinosaurs as some kind of elaborate Victorian disaster dressed up as a triumph. They were not that. They were a genuine, extraordinary achievement, the first time in human history that ordinary people, regardless of wealth or education, could stand in front of a life-sized reconstruction of a creature that had walked the earth millions of years before any human being existed to see it and feel correctly. That they were witnessing something new in the world. Sir Richard Owen's science would be substantially revised within a few decades, the iguanodon's nose horn quietly relocated to its thumb, its posture corrected from a heavy quadrupedal crouch to something closer to an active bipedal animal, but the essential ambition behind the project to make the deep past visible, physical, and available to anyone with a shilling remains one of the more admirable impulses of the entire Victorian era, however imperfectly it was executed on this particular June morning. What this account has tried to do, instead, is restore the missing half of that morning, the half that never made it into the newspaper engravings or the celebratory accounts written afterward by men who arrived by private carriage and left before the worst of the afternoon crowding set in. The wonder was real. So was the heat trapped inside layers of wool and whalebone. So was the lead and lime absorbed quietly into a labourer's body over 9 unrecorded months. So was the fear of bad air that pointed an entire population away from the actual danger, quietly spreading through a water pump a few miles to the north. So was the inadequate sanitation, the bending railing, the overheated glass gallery, and the careful, unglamorous household arithmetic that made a single day's pleasure cost a family like Josiah's considerably more than the price of admission alone. All of it happened in the same few hours to the same bodies at the same lake, and none of it cancelled out the wonder. It simply completed the picture, the portraits and the postcards left unfinished. Josiah Webb, as this account has said from its opening minutes, exists nowhere in the parish registers of Bermondsey or the wage books of Sydenham. He is a composite built from the well-documented, thoroughly researched experience of the actual workforce that spent the winter of 1853 constructing these animals under Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins' direction, and from the equally well-documented experience of the working-class families who made up the overwhelming majority of the Crystal Palace's earliest and most numerous visitors. But the dinosaurs themselves are entirely real, and most of them remarkably still stand today in the same park at Sydenham, weathered by more than a century and a half of English seasons, restored and protected in recent decades as Grade 1 listed monuments and recognized as irreplaceable landmarks in the history of how science communicates itself to the public. Richard Owen's name still attached to them. Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins is now, at last, properly credited as their sculptor, and in many respects, their genuine intellectual co-author. The names of the men who mixed the cement, hauled the brick, and absorbed the lime and the lead into their own skin over that long, unrecorded winter appear nowhere on any plaque, which is precisely why this account has spent an evening trying to put one there, in words. There is something clarifying, at the end of a day this thoroughly examined, in simply naming what has been true the entire time. Victorian Britain built something truly wonderful at Sydenham in 1854, and it built that wonder on top of an enormous, largely invisible foundation of physical risk, discomfort, and quiet endurance carried by exactly the people least equipped to complain about it. The animals are still there. The lake is calmer now, properly maintained, its water no longer a source of genuine civic dread. The railings have long since been replaced with sturdier ones, and somewhere in the deep, undocumented background of that achievement, a young bricklayer's labourer and his family walked home one June evening, tired, sunburned, and thirsty, carrying a missing shoe and a story they would tell for years afterward as one of the finest days of their lives, which, in its own complicated and entirely human way. This particular story very nearly did not survive to be told this clearly. By the early 20th century, the Crystal Palace itself had fallen into a long, slow institutional decline, and the animals surrounding its grounds, fashionable once beyond anything else in England, drifted for decades into a kind of quiet civic embarrassment, dismissed by a more scientifically confident era as simply the quaint mistakes of an earlier, cruder age of paleontology. Weeds grew up around the islands. Paint faded and was not always replaced. Several smaller figures were lost entirely to neglect and vandalism across the 20th century, and the surviving animals spent long stretches without any serious conservation attention at all, their scientific inaccuracy treated as sufficient reason to let them simply weather away rather than a reason to study. How confidently a brilliant mind can be wrong. It took a dedicated, patient effort by later historians and conservationists, including a major restoration project completed in the 1950 seconds, and further conservation work continuing into the present century, to keep the animals standing at all. That a monument does not need to be scientifically accurate to be historically irreplaceable. The park earned full statutory listing protection in the closing decades of the 20th century, and in 2022, the researchers Eleanor, Mikkel, and Mark Whitten published the most detailed scholarly account yet produced of exactly how Owen and Hawkins arrived at each of their reconstructions, restoring the specific fossils and the specific arguments that shaped every joint and every disputed horn. Their work, along with decades of scholarship before it, from historians including Adrian Desmond, has helped later generations see the Sydenham animals not as an embarrassing footnote to be quietly forgotten, but as a rare and invaluable record of how scientific knowledge actually develops, provisionally and always through the hands of specific people working with incomplete evidence and their own era's assumptions. The animals are, in this sense, more valuable for having been wrong in exactly the ways they were wrong. A fixed and dated snapshot of one moment in the long, unfinished argument about what the deep past actually looked like. The candle is low now, and the lake at Sydenham has gone quiet for the night, the animals settling back into the patient, unlit stillness they will hold until morning brings the next day's crowd. Somewhere out past the edge of the grounds, a small family walks the last stretch home in the dark. A little sunburned, a little footsore, already half asleep on their feet, already beginning, without quite meaning to remember the day, something lighter and simpler than it actually was. Let them have that. It is, after everything this evening has uncovered, still entirely true. Sleep well.